pleasure to be chairing the presentation for Karim. Karim was born in Arbabil, northwest of Iran. Is the right pronunciation?
No.
Arbabil.
Yes.
And obtained his Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering in 2009 from Mumra.
That's hard.
At Arbabil University. And his master in earthquake engineering in 2012 from the International Institute of Earthquake Engineering and Seismology, I guess in Tehran.
Yep.
Karim joined Professor Brendon Research Group in 2013, focusing on seismic hazard analysis and ground motion selection, where he is now a postdoc fellow. He was awarded the 2016 New Zealand Society for Earthquake Engineering Student Research Award at the annual NZSC conference in Christchurch. Karim's current research is focusing now on physical-based ground motion simulation for probabilistic seismic hazard analysis in New Zealand, and the application of simulated ground motion for seismic response analysis. It's 30 minutes.
Maybe 40.
40? Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming to this presentation. The topic of the presentation is ground motion selection. You guys probably most likely have come across the situation that you want to run the analysis of a geotechnical or a structure, geotechnical system or a building or a bridge, and you want to go and find some ground motions to run the analysis with. So you have a large data set of recorded ground motions, you have a large data set of simulated ground motions. The challenging task here is to select those few number of ground motion records that you can use to run your analyses, and then get an unbiased performance matrix of your system. If we put this in the context of performance assessment methodology, starting from quantifying the seismic hazard to seismic demand, damage, and loss, this is where the ground motion selection sits. It's a joint between seismic hazard analysis and seismic demand analysis, or seismic response analysis. And if your selected ground motion should appropriately represent the hazard in order to get an unbiased distribution of the response for your system. We have dealt with 4 objectives in this research. I'm not going to talk about the last one, but we'll briefly mention some findings and some high-level view on the first 3 ones. You can refer to the documents in case you're interested. So the first objective is the scenario-based ground motion selection. When we say scenario-based ground motion selection, assume a scenario rupture, for example, alpine fault rupture. You want to find out what is the performance of your system if there's a rupture in alpine fault. In order to do that, you need to select some ground motions that represent that rupture and then run analysis of your system in order to obtain the distribution of the response for your system. So that's the ground motion, scenario-based ground motion selection comes into the picture. First, let's talk about what is the methodology we have used or partially developed for selecting ground motions. Usually when you are selecting ground motion, you're selecting based on the spectral acceleration of that ground motion against the response spectrum of what is this prescribed in the code or what you have obtained from your hazard analysis. So assume this red line as the median ground motion across the whole a wide range of vibration periods, and this is your spectral acceleration, and let's say this is 60th and 84th percentiles. You want to find out ground motions that in the database of recorded or simulated ground motions that can represent this distribution of intensity measures. The first the second step, after developing that target for ground motion, that red line, is to throw a realization out of this distribution. So this is one realization, one potential ground motion that might occur due to the rupture in that scenario fault, and due to that scenario rupture in the fault. And the next step is to find a ground motion that can fit this realization and can have and has the smallest misfit to this realization. So this whole topic of ground motion selection is to have a target, these red lines here, and then generate a realization of the target distribution, select a ground motion from the database of recorded or simulated ground motion that can fit that realization. So if you do this 20 times, you have 20 realization, you have 20 ground motions that you have selected. You can appropriately represent the distribution of the, in this case, spectral acceleration or any other intensity measure with the selected ground motions. The methodology we are using considers two things. One is the variability in these intensity measure levels. For a spectral acceleration at a given period, you have a variability of the spectral acceleration or any other intensity measure. You need to represent that in the selected ground motions. The 20 or 10 or whatever number of ground motions you are selecting has to be should be representing that variability in the intensity measure. That's one of the features of this approach. The other one is using multiple intensity measures, and I will come back to this. In terms of formulation, there are three stages. There's a building target for intensity measure target. The second one is generating a realization from that, and the third one is finding ground motion that fits to that realization. I'm going to talk about the formula. It's in the document. You can look at it, but let's go back to considering multiple intensity measure, which was part of this research, in order to understand which intensity measures should be used as a default for unbiased ground motion selection test. So if you look at the ground motion features, you have four types of features you need to represent. One is the amplitude of the motion, second one is frequency content, third is duration of the ground motion, and the fourth one is the cumulative effects of that ground motions. If you represent these four features, then you have an unbiased ground motion ensembles to run your analysis. In order to represent these features, we are using different intensity measures. So for amplitude of the ground motion, we usually, like engineers and researchers, use peak ground acceleration or peak ground velocity. For frequency content, usually pseudo-spectral acceleration is used. And for duration, you use significant duration, and for cumulative effects, usually RES intensity and cumulative absolute velocity is used. So using these intensity measures, we want to select ground motions that are unbiased representation of the hazard. Well, since we are considering a number of large number of intensity measures or different types of intensity measures, we need to assign a weight to them in a sense that some of them are more important than the other ones. And this weight, the idea of weight is basically incorporated into the misfit that we are calculating for the selected ground motions. So we are assigning weight to a given intensity measure type, and then when we are calculating the misfit of that candidate ground motions, this weight is basically changing the misfit of that ground motion. If a given ground motion intensity measure has a large weight, and that ground motion intensity measure for a candidate record is not good enough to represent the hazard, then the misfit will be large, and we will throw that ground motion away. We will go for another one. And this measure D is basically the largest deviation from the target target distribution that selected ground motion distribution has. So if you select 20 ground motions and you plot the distribution of a given intensity measure, you'll get this blue line. And from hazard analysis, you get this red line. There's a deviation between them. If you take that, if you measure that and use it here, you will calculate the misfit. So different weight distributions are tested for a large number of ground motion intensity measures. I'm giving you an overview of what is important in terms of selecting ground motions that are unbiased. These are the least you can do. There's a lot you can do in terms, depending on the project and the system you are investigating. So if we build this red lines in a sense that this is a median hazard we are expecting at the site, and these are the 60th and 84th percentile, and consider and put all of our weight on spectral acceleration, we can go and find 20 ground motions that can fit these targets. So these gray lines are individual ground motions. And if you plot the statistics of these selected ground motions, which are represented by these blue lines, you will basically see there's a good fit. So your selected ground motions have a good fit to the spectral acceleration. But if you compare the duration of these ground motions against the target, you will see that this is biased. That the duration of the ground motions, the median is off this much, the other percentiles are off. The reason is that in the selection process, we haven't considered duration as an important intensity measure. The weight we had on the duration intensity measure was 0. Well, you can easily solve this by putting some weight on it. And when you're selecting your ground motion, you are basically taking care how much misfit you have in terms of that intensity measure, in this case, significant duration. If you do that, you might end up with bias for other feature of the ground motion, cumulative measures. So as a representative, for example, CAB, cumulative absolute velocity. So the same ground motions that are selected have this bias or imprecise representation of the CAB in this case. Well, in order to incorporate that, in order to consider this, you need to consider CAB in your ground motion selection. Well, we have tested many ground motion weight on these intensity measures, and this is the default weight factor we have kind of recommended. That's the minimum you can do in terms of getting the unbiased representation of the hazard. So you distribute 70% of your weight on the spectral acceleration, but you give like 30% to other duration and cumulative measures. And the only reason we have 0 weight on these intensity measures is because they are represented by spectral acceleration. So if you don't cover a range of frequency content in your ground motion selection, you might benefit from including these intensity measures. But if your selection is based on a wide range of spectral acceleration, you can ignore these intensity measures. The reason there's a smaller weight on these duration and cumulative measures is because you need to have a frequency content and amplitude of the ground shaking in a favorable situation or strong to induce inelastic response in your system, nonlinear response in your system. If that occurs, then the duration of the ground shaking will be important. If there's a damage in your system and a ground motion lasts 20 seconds, the final stage of the structure will be different than if the ground shaking lasts 40 seconds. So that's why if the shaking is strong, the cumulative measures and the duration of the ground shaking will be important. Okay, you can using that default weight vector, you can select ground motions. If you compare this to the previous figure, there's a larger misfit to the spectral acceleration. The reason is that we have taken out some weight and put on other intensity measures here, but in overall, these ensembles, these selected ground motions have a good representation of duration and spectral acceleration, and also cumulative measures. So that's RS intensity and CAV. You can use this methodology to select ground motions that are representing realistic scenarios. So if this is the alpine fault rupture, you can select ground motions that represent that alpine fault rupture. This design spectrum is basically, we have plotted this for comparison. The shaking from alpine fault is not as strong as you might expect comparing to design spectrum, but you can compare it to, you can do this for Wellington fault, which is running through the Wellington city, and the shaking that you should represent based on hazard analysis is larger than the design spectrum. So using the methodology developed and utilizing the relative importance of different intensity measures, you can run this type of ground motion selection, which you can use to analyze the scenario performance of your system. If you have a structure right here, you want to know what will happen to that structure if Wellington fault ruptures. You can use these ground motions to analyze your system and come up with the demand measures. So the key contributions of this part of the research was to the ground motion, the scenario-based ground motion selection developed, and also utilizing different weight vectors. There are other contributions which there's no time to discuss, but you can refer to the document. The second objective that I'm going to talk about is near-fault ground motion selection, and specifically representing directivity effects. So if you're close to a fault and there's a rupture with certain characteristics, with the rupture velocity close to the shear wave velocity in that part of the cross, you might get a superposition of the seismic waves. This will result in a pulse-like motion in the ground shaking. And this pulse-like motion, depending on your structure, may induce large demand in your system. Coming back to the performance assessment methodology, if you want to consider this pulse-like motion, we need to consider it in this seismic hazard analysis stage. So you will do your seismic hazard analysis in a way that accounts for this directivity effect, or pulse-like motion effect. Then you will select your ground motions that represent that hazard, which will end up representing the near-fault effects. Directivity or near-fault directivity effects, what will happen is that there will be an increase in the spectral acceleration for long period ground shaking. So the black lines here, these are different percentiles, 60s, 50s, and 84s. The black line is from a conventional ground motion model which doesn't explicitly account for the directivity effects. And the red line is from a model that accounts for the directivity effect. As you can see, there's an increase in the spectral acceleration at long period content. I should note that for this type of analysis, for considering the directivity effects in your hazard analysis, the methodology that we have presented considers multiple realization of hypocenter, which affects the results you get in terms of the amplification in your spectral acceleration, and also considers the full distribution of pulse periods. So if you have a magnitude 6 rupture, there's a distribution of pulse period that you might expect from that rupture. And you need to account for the full distribution of pulse period in order to be rigorous in your seismic hazard analysis. We can go and select ground motions from the database of recorded ground motions that represent that directivity included hazard. And this is an example case, magnitude 7.5 and rupture 5 kilometers. By the way, the resolution of the figures were really nice on my laptop. Not nice here. So you have this red lines to target from seismic hazard analysis. You go and select ground motions, and I've plotted those directivity ground motions in blue and those ordinary ground motions in a sense that they don't have directivity pulses in gray. If you calculate the statistics of that selected ground motion, you can see that there's a good fit of the selected ground motion to the target hazard. And there is a point here, the target, this rupture, this is a specific rupture, based on a model that is proposed by Shahi and Baker, we are expecting to have 80% directivity probability. Ideally, we want to represent this, not ideally, but most likely we would want to represent this in the selected ground motion. So when we are selecting 20 ground motions, we want to select enough number of ground motions that will represent this 80%. At this example here, the methodology, the realization and the selection of the ground shaking only picks 13 out of 20. So the represented probability of directivity is 65%. So the question here is that, is it really important to get the right number of directivity ground shaking? So is it really important to select enough ground shaking that exactly represent this probability of directivity? And if selection based on intensity measure is good enough, or you just need to explicitly consider pulse-like ground motion versus non-pulse-like ground motion. There's a lot in this figure in terms of the number of the ground motions, directivity ground motions that are selected for different scenarios, but I will focus only on the magnitude 7.5. These different bars are representing the distribution of the number of the pulse-like ground motions that are selected for different replicate selection. The first point to emphasize is that this 80% probability of directivity has an uncertainty in its own, in the sense that the database that is used is limited, and also there's an extrapolation for large magnitude ruptures. So there's an unknown uncertainty around the target probability of directivity. So the second point is that this bar over here is ground motion selection based on considering duration, CAV, and other spectral acceleration in a wide range. So we call this a holistic intense ground motion selection, in a sense that it considers all the important features of the ground shaking. This type of ground motion performs better in a sense that it picks off large number of directivity ground motions to represent this target probability of directivity. And the third point is that as we get farther away from the fault, the number of the ground motions that are selected using this approach is reduced, but they're not exactly representing these probability of directivity, but at least there's a trend of in getting smaller number of directivity ground motion. Another feature of the selected directivity ground motions is the pulse period of them. We want to see if the selected ground motions, the directivity ground motions that are selected, have a good representation of the pulse period of the scenario rupture we are trying to represent. So if we have this rupture of magnitude 7.5 and 5 kilometer distance, this red line is the predicted or estimated pulse period distribution, and the selected ground motions are representing that target distribution within the statistical rejection bounds. So it's good enough to say that the selected ground motions are good enough to say that the selected ground motions, in terms of pulse period, they're representing the target hazard. Well, in order to identify if the number of the ground motions that are selected from number of the pulse-like ground motions selected, or the period of them, pulse period of them are important, we need to analyze and structure to against different ensembles that have different number of ground motions, directivity ground motions, in order to identify if the number of directivity ground motion as important as other intensity measure-based factors. So this is a single degree of freedom system. It's a degrading system in strength and stiffness, and it has a 3-second vibration period. If we subject that single degree of freedom system to the selected ground motions that are representing that hazard at that 7.5 magnitude rupture, you will get this distribution for the maximum displacement of that single degree of freedom system. And this is a collapse limit, a nominal collapse limit based on the ductility of 3. And there are a couple of points here. One is that these points here with the circle identifies the demand of the system due to directivity ground motions. So the directivity ground motions can result in demands that are less than other non-directivity ground motions. So if you have 2 ground motions, one of them has a pulse in it, the other one doesn't have, you cannot say for sure that the one with a pulse will result in larger demand in your system. If we select 20 ground motions, 20 replicate ground motions that are representing the same hazard, and run the structural analysis for these 20 replicate ground motion ensembles, you will get 20 distribution of the demand. What you can see is that the same trend is here. You might get a smaller demand from directivity ground shaking. In overall, the distribution of them are similar. The only difference between the selected ground motions are that they have different number of directivity ground motions in them. So this put forward this idea that, well, for example, this ensemble here has the largest number of directivity ground motions. So out of 20 records that are selected, 15 of them are directivity, so they have pulses. This other ensemble has the least number of directivity ground motion. It has 9 out of 20. But as you can see, the distribution of the demand is the same, similar, not the same, similar. So this put forward this idea that is the number of directivity ground motions that are selected within an ensemble is more important than the intensity measure of those ground shake. The 20 ground motions that are selected here, from the ground motion selection point of view, they are all valid because they are all representing the target hazard distribution. That's why the distribution of the demand is similar. Because they have similar intensity measures, they represent the hazard. And as a result of that, the number of the directivity ground motions within that ensemble is not a governing factor in terms of the demand distribution we get. We can do this with directivity-based ground motion seismic hazard analysis for a PSHA case where we consider not one scenario, all the scenarios that are affecting the site. This is an example for San Francisco, and the black line represents the seismic hazard curve for non-directed, for a conventional approach that doesn't account for directivity, and the other one, the red one, represent hazard curve for directivity analysis. And there's an increase in the intensity measure for this specific intensity measure for spectral acceleration at 3 seconds for a different range of hazard levels. And this is the deaggregation result in the sense that it identifies which scenario contributes to the hazard based on their magnitude and probability of directivity. We can again, using the same methodology, we can go and select ground shakings that are representing this hazard. And some of those ground motions will be directivity ground motions, meaning that they will have pulses in them. The other one will be non-directivity or ordinary ground motions. And in overall, they represent the target hazard. So the blue line is close to the red line in overall. If we compare the pulse period of the selected ground motion with respect to the target pulse period, we will see that there's a good match. But in this range, maybe because we don't have a recorded ground motion from large magnitudes with directivity pulses, we have a misfit from the selected ground in the selected ground motion in terms of representing this upper tail of the target. That can be filled by using the simulated ground motions, because we can simulate. If we have enough confidence in the simulated ground motions, after rigorous validation, we can use the simulated ground motions to select a ground motion selection and fill that gap in the selected ensembles. So in terms of PSHA-based ground motion selection, the aim is to calculate the demand hazard, which is basically summation of the demand exceedance probability by ground motion likelihood, and you will get a figure. You will get a curve like this. This is the exceedance annual frequency of exceedance for different demand levels. So if you do this for 20 replicate ground motions that we have selected, you will end up with 20 lines for the demand hazard that you have calculated. So you did this calculation 20 times for 20 replicate ensembles that are selected at each intensity measure level. You will get 20 demand hazard curves. Same with the scenario case. If you try to spot what is the contribution of the number of directivity ground motion, this red line over here comes from ensembles that have largest number of directivity ground motion in them, and the green one is coming from the ensembles that have smallest number of directivity ground motions. They are pretty much the same. So the idea here is that if you are selecting ground motion based on in a holistic manner, based on intensity measures that are representing different features of ground motions, you don't need to have a strict criteria on pulse period of the ground shaking or number of the directivity ground motions in your ground motion selection. That was the contribution of this part of the thesis. The third part that I'm going to present is the epistemic uncertainty propagation part. In seismic hazard analysis, we have two types of uncertainties. One is natural or apparent variability of the ground shaking in this case. And the other one is the uncertainty we have due to lack of knowledge. So if you have two different models developed by two different groups, if you use them for seismic hazard analysis, you will get two different results for seismic hazard for your ground motion in your site. So that's a uncertainty due to the lack of knowledge. So since we don't know things that we don't know, we end up developing different models that represent the same scenario, same situation. That is referred to as epistemic uncertainty. By default, probabilistic seismic hazard analysis accounts for the first one, the apparent aleatory variability, because it considers different levels of ground shaking that are possible and different rupture occurrences, and then it sums them, and at the end you will get a single hazard curve. So in essence, probabilistic seismic hazard analysis is a way to account for the first one, the aleatory variability in your ground shaking. The second one, the epistemic one, is represented by using different models. So if this is your hazard curve, you are using two models in calculating that hazard curve. The first one is the ground motion model. The second one is the model that you are using to characterize the rupture probability or rupture rate. So if you change those models, you will end up with different ground the seismic hazard curve. So this is done for San Francisco. This is an example for San Francisco Bay Area. Using different ground motion models and different rupture occurrence model, you will get this much variation in your hazard curve. So if you're looking at a single intensity measure level, and this is large scale, this is a really large probability of exceedance for your giving intensity measure level. Using different models, you will get this much variation in your hazard. If you're looking at a single hazard level, you'll get this much. This is large. This is also log scale. There's a large variation of ground shaking for a given level of hazard that you're interested in. This is due to epistemic uncertainty. So this is due to having different models for ground motion and rupture occurrence. In the context of seismic performance assessment, epistemic uncertainty and seismic hazard analysis sits in this area that in order to account for epistemic uncertainty, you need to use alternative models for seismic hazard analysis. This will give you alternative seismic hazard curves, which you need to go and do ground motion selection, and then run seismic demand analysis and damage and loss in order to represent that epistemic uncertainty in the seismic hazard. That small chunk of the performance methodology has the 4 steps in it. So first you do your seismic hazard analysis, then you do your ground motion selection, you will run your seismic response analysis, and at the end you will calculate the seismic demand. So the objective of this part of the research was to develop methodologies to account for the epistemic uncertainty in the seismic hazard part. So 3 methodologies are presented. We're calling them exact distribution, the other one is approximate distribution, and the third one is approximate mean. I will present these methodologies based on an example case. So this is the location, and the ground motion model is used to conduct seismic hazard analysis, and we have 100 realization of a given rupture model, and at the end we have 400 realization, meaning that 400 different hazard curves for the same location. To represent those hazards at those 12 intensity measure levels, and then for each ground motion ensembles, we will select 20 records. The first one, the exact one, selects ground motions at each intensity measure level for a specific hazard curve, and then runs the response history analysis of the system, and then combines them to get seismic demand hazard, and does the same thing for all of the hazard curves. So if you have 400 hazard curves, you need to select ground motion and run seismic response analysis for all of them one by one. This will give you 400 demand hazard curves that are representing the true seismic demand distribution. So this is the example case. You have 400 hazard curves. By selecting ground motions for each of them at a given intensity measure and combining them to calculate demand hazard, this is the distribution of demand hazard you will get. And at a given demand level, the distribution of probability of exceedance for that demand is the exact probability of this. It's the exact distribution for that probability of exceedance, because you have treated every hazard curve separately by selecting ground motion specific to that hazard curve. Well, let's see how much computational effort you have to put into this. If you have n models, n hazard curves, in this case, in this example, we had 400, which is, if you are designing a critical structure, this is actually a small number. You might have like 1,000, depending on the system. And if you are selecting ground motion at 20 intensity measure levels, and for each ensembles you have 20 records, you need to run 4,800 ground motion selection tasks. So you need to select ground motions 4,800 times. And you need to run response history analysis of your system 96,000 times. If you have a complex system, it's not really feasible. It could be feasible, but you need to spend time on it and money. So this gives an idea to the approximate distribution. So we try to approximate that full distribution using a less computational, an approach that is less computationally demanding. So in order to do that, the biggest part of the problem is running the response history analysis of the system. So if you run it for a smaller number of cases, then you will have a less computational burden. If we select ground motions that are representing only the mean hazard and run response history analysis of the system against those ground motions, subject the system to the ground motions that are representing only the mean hazard, and then integrate it with all the hazard curves, you'll get an approximation for the full distribution of the demand hazard. So these blue lines are coming from the exact approach. The gray lines on top of them are coming from the approximate full distribution approach. You will still get a distribution of the demand hazard, the probability of exceedance for a given demand level, but this is an approximation of the exact value. In terms of computation, since you have one hazard curve, the mean hazard curve, and you are selecting ground motion, let's say at 12 intensity measure levels, then you have 12 ground motion selection tasks. And then you have 240 response history analysis to run. So this is way less than the previous numbers. The third approach is that you run the ground motion, you select ground motions representing the mean hazard, but you also use the mean hazard to calculate the demand hazard. At the end, you will end up with a single demand hazard. Here, this one, which we call it approximate mean, because exact mean will be the mean of these blue lines, but this is an approximate mean. That is the conventional way of doing this. If you are in the engineering practice and also maybe in research too, if you are calculating demand hazard, you are calculating it based on ground motions that are selected to represent the mean hazard, and you integrate it with the mean hazard to get these approximate mean. This is what is conventionally done. And in terms of calculation, it's the same computational effort, because calculating the demand hazard is not really a big deal. Conducting ground motion selection and response history analysis is the demanding part, which is the same as to a second approach. So in terms of comparison between these three methodologies, exact distribution, approximate distribution, and approximate mean, you can compare them based on ground motion selection tasks and based on response history analysis tasks. If the ground motion, if what you get from this approach is close to this one, you might use this to estimate the exact distribution of the demand hazard. In order to find out if this can be done, we are comparing the different percentiles of the demand hazard for this single degree of freedom system that we have considered. And what you find out is that at demand levels that are below that are not really close to the demand, the collapse limit, the agreement between these exact distribution and approximate distribution is good enough. But once you get close to the collapse limit, the variation in the results is larger. So variation in the demand hazard from a exact approach is larger than from the approximate distribution approach. Well, the key contribution of this part of the research is basically the methodologies that I've put forward and also that we have put forward, and also the comparison in terms of at which range of demand you might get a good agreement between the approximate distribution and exact distribution. The number of items you can consider for future work. In case you're interested, I can give you these, but I'll move to the last slide. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thanks, Karim, for this very comprehensive and interesting presentation. Now, usually there's no question, but since Karim already defended successfully the oral exam, maybe I will just have a couple of questions quickly. Any question?
So, from what you currently know, what could be done to reduce the discrepancy between the approximates and the exact distribution near the collapse limits?
Well,
or how could we get around that discrepancy?
That's since you are using ensembles of ground motions representing only the mean hazard, there's nothing you can do about it. If you don't want to get that approximation, you need to select based on a specific hazard curve. It's not, the idea is that there's nothing you can do about it. If you are happy with if you want to spend less money or spend less time on the computation, you have to do approximate distribution. If you want exact results, you have to do the comprehensive or exact distribution approach. There's nothing in between in the sense that if you spend less time on response history analysis and ground motion selection, you'll get an approximation of the final demand.
There's time for one more question.
You can go for more than one.
Hi, thanks, Karim. When you presented the hazard curve, the complete one, you said you used 400 models.
Yep.
I suppose that when you calculate the probability distribution, you consider every model like good as all the others, like equivalent good. Is there a way to reduce the probability by doing the same process that you did, like assigning a weight based on which model is more accurate?
Well, there's a weight in those hazard curve based on how much confidence you have in terms of how good they are to represent the true nature of the problem. So these so each one of these hazard curves have weight associated with them based on how good the ground motion model is to represent the true nature of the ground shaking in that region, also how good that one realization of the rupture model has. So there's a weight for each of them. But if your question is that how we can, for example, approximate the exact distribution by running a smaller number of realization from this full distribution, maybe that could be done, I guess, but I haven't tried it. But this is also a realization of the true nature of the problem. So these 400s are not the true range of the problem. They're not representing the true range of what we are dealing with. They're actually realization out of the whole problem. Running another simulation on top of it, I don't think you will get better results, but there's a weight associated with each of them that you can consider for weighting the demand hazard curve.
With respect to the second part, so the number of pulse ground motions, yeah. In that case, it's also influenced by the size of the set of ground motions, because you are basically trying to do statistical inference of the characteristic. So, in that sense, what's the influence of and what size would you recommend?
Well, Size of the number of ground motion is a topic we didn't address in this research, partially because we were focused on developing methodologies, but although I didn't represent it here, I didn't present it here, I have run ground motion ensembles with 10 and 50 number of records. So I've selected 50 and also 10 ground motion ensembles. Calculated the same ratio for number of directivity in both of them. The results in terms of the ideas we are putting forward in terms of the number of directivity ground motions are not important as long as you select your ground motion based on right intensity measures, cumulative intensity measures, duration. The idea is the same, so that there's a consistent trend in these different ensembles. The size of them doesn't matter, but specifically you might get different results. For example, if you select 10 ground motions, you might get a large number of directivity ground motions or a smaller number of directivity ground motions. From ground motion selection perspective, if you're using right intensity measures, those intensity measures are on its own affected by pulse motion. So if you have a pulse motion, they are affecting the intensity measures. If your directivity effect is included in the hazard and you're selecting to represent that hazard, you will automatically pick some ground motions that are representing those pulse properties in terms of the number of the pulse and pulse period. And if you run the demand seismic analysis on your demand analysis on your system, you'll get the same distribution of the demand. So the idea is that if you're using right intensity measures to represent a full picture in terms of different features of ground shaking, then you should not focus on how many directivity ground motions that I'm selecting, because what you're selecting represents the directivity included hazard.
Thanks.
Question?
I was interested to hear your thoughts about maybe more future, but like at the moment you're selecting ground motions to match a hazard curve, and then you're saying we can simulate ground motions. So what do you think about the future of ground motion selection, knowing that we might be able to one day simulate ground motion?
Well, in order to simulate ground motion, we still need to represent the variability in different parameters of the source process, path process, propagation of the waves, and also side effects. This results in a large number of simulated ground motions. So for a given scenario, let's say magnitude 7 in a distance in this specific fold, at the end of your simulation, you might get like a couple of hundreds of ground motion because there is a different realization for hypocenter, for slip distribution, for different parameters of your source, for different parameters that characterize your site and your path. At the end, you will have large number of ground motions that are simulated. Then this is again the ground motion selection test. You need to select like 20 ground motions out of those couple of hundreds to run your analysis. You don't want to run your analysis for 400 simulated ground motion. You want to pick 20, 10, or whatever number you're interested, then run the analysis using those ground motions. So the ground motion selection task still comes to the picture that after simulating ground motions, regardless of the methodology you're using, after simulating ground motion, if you're representing the hazard in a rigorous way by considering different perturbation of the governing factors, then you will end up with large number of motions, and then you will go and select ground motions ideally using the same methodology. You will select the realization or a simulated ground motion that fits the target with a misfit between target and the simulated ground motion.
It's time for the very last question. Okay, if there are no additional questions, please join me in congratulating once again Karim. Yeah, I think this is the end of this presentation.
I just wanted to thank my main supervisor for everything he's done for me since you guys are all here. Thank you so much.